My name is Sienna Evans. I am 34 years old, and I have spent the last 12 years of my life as a registered nurse in the high-stakes environment of the intensive care unit at County General Hospital, a place where the truth is usually laid bare by the cold, rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor. I am a woman who deals in hard data, lab results, and the undeniable reality of physical symptoms. Yet I spent 3 decades blind to the rot festering within the walls of my own childhood home in the suburbs of Oak Ridge. My father, Marcus Evans, is a man whose reputation is as polished as the silver communion trays he carries every Sunday morning as a senior deacon at Grace Fellowship. To the community, he is a pillar of moral fortitude, a man who quotes scripture with a resonant baritone and maintains a lawn so pristine it looks like a digital rendering. But 3 weeks ago, a simple curiosity, a $30 saliva kit from an ancestry website, acted like a scalpel cutting through a long-hidden abscess, revealing that the man I called Dad was actually a master architect of a life built on a foundation of sand. It began as a light-hearted distraction during a rare, quiet moment at the nurse's station, where I scrolled through a notification on my iPhone 15 Pro, only to find that my DNA did not match the man who had raised me, nor did it match the extensive paternal lineage the Evans family had bragged about for generations. When I confronted him in our mahogany-paneled study, the scent of expensive pipe tobacco still clinging to his Brooks Brothers blazer, he didn't offer a hug or a tearful explanation. Instead, he leaned across his heavy oak desk, his face contorting into a mask of cold, calculated rage that I had never seen before. He told me that he did not need a machine to tell him who he was, and commanded me to delete the app immediately, stating that if I didn't, I was choosing a stranger over my own blood, a threat that was quickly followed by the most chilling ultimatum I had ever heard. He looked me dead in the eye and whispered that if I breathed a word of this to my mother or the church board, he would stop paying the $4,800 monthly invoice for Grandma Rose's specialized memory care facility and move her to the state-funded nursing home downtown, a place we all knew was a nightmare of neglected call bells and fluorescent lights. But I am getting ahead of myself, and to understand the weight of this betrayal, I have to take you back to the way things used to be in the Evans household, where appearances were the only currency that mattered. Growing up, I was the invisible daughter, the one who worked double shifts and studied until 3 a.m. at the local library to earn a scholarship, so I wouldn't be a burden on the family finances. My brother, Julian, was the golden child, a 31-year-old luxury real estate agent who drove a 2024 sapphire blue Porsche Taycan and lived in a glass-walled condo that cost more than my entire 10-year savings account. Julian never had to ask for anything. My father simply handed him the world on a silver platter, funding his failed business ventures and paying off his staggering credit card debts without a single murmur of discontent. I remember sitting at our formal dining table last Christmas, the air smelling of pine needles and expensive Joe Malone candles, watching my father hand Julian an envelope containing a $15,000 check for a down payment on a boat, while I sat there in my faded scrubs, having just come from a 12-hour shift where I'd lost a patient I had fought all night to save. My father had looked at me with a sort of polite indifference, the kind you reserve for a distant cousin you only see at funerals, and asked if the hospital was still as depressing as ever. The contrast was always there, sharp and jagged like a piece of broken glass. I was the one who checked on Grandma Rose every single day. I was the one who managed her medication and made sure her silk pillows were fluffed, yet Julian was the one who received the praise, the inheritance promises, and the seat of honor at my father's right hand. The day the DNA results arrived, I was sitting in my kitchen, a small, functional space in a modest apartment where I pay $1,900 a month in rent, a far cry from the gated community where my parents reside. I was drinking a lukewarm cup of coffee from my Keurig when the email notification popped up, and as I clicked the link, I expected to see a map of Wales and Scotland, the places my father always claimed our ancestors hailed from. Instead, the screen showed a 50% match to a man named David Miller, a name I had never heard in my life, and a 0% match to the entire Evans family tree that my father had meticulously documented in a leather-bound book. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I realized that the man who had demanded total obedience and perfection from me for 34 years wasn't even my biological father. When I drove over to their house in my 2021 Toyota RAV4, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I found him in the garage, detailing his 2023 midnight black Cadillac Escalade with a microfiber cloth and a bottle of premium wax that probably cost $50. He didn't even look up when I approached him with the phone in my hand, the screen glowing with the proof of his deception. When I finally spoke, my voice cracking under the weight of the revelation, he didn't deny it. He didn't apologize for the lie that had defined my existence. Instead, he turned off the garage lights and walked toward me, his shadow looming large and menacing in the dim twilight. He told me that he had spent 30 years protecting this family from the truth, and that he wasn't about to let a cheap medical test destroy the empire he had built. He spoke about his position in the church, the $500,000 he had donated to the new community wing, and how my selfish quest for the truth would ruin my mother's fragile mental health. But the real blow came when he mentioned Grandma Rose, the woman who had raised me when my mother was too caught up in social galas and charity luncheons to notice I was lonely. He knew she was my weakness. He knew that the thought of her sitting in a cramped two-person room at a budget facility, smelling of bleach and despair, would be enough to break me. He laid it out like a business transaction, silence in exchange for her safety, a deal signed in the blood of the father he wasn't. As I stood there on the pristine driveway, the cold Virginia wind biting through my thin jacket, I realized that every memory I had of him, the firm handshakes, the stern lectures on honesty, the prayers before dinner, were all part of an elaborate performance. He wasn't a man of God, he was a man of masks, and I was just a pawn he had used to maintain the illusion of a perfect, God-fearing family. Now, as I sit in my car in the hospital parking lot, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing with a dull, insistent hum, I feel the weight of the silence he's trying to buy. I think about the real cost of his lie, not just the financial price of Grandma's care, but the emotional bankruptcy of a man who would trade his own mother's dignity to keep a secret. I think about David Miller, the stranger on my screen, and I wonder if he has the same eyes as me, if he likes his coffee black, or if he also feels a strange, inexplicable pull toward the ocean. I look at my hands, the hands that have started IVs, held the palms of the dying, and delivered news that shatters worlds, and I realize they are the only things in this life that are truly mine. My father thinks he can control the narrative because he controls the bank account, but he forgets that I am a nurse. I am trained to see through the skin to the bone, to recognize when a system is failing, and to act even when the odds are stacked against me. He believes he has buried the truth under a pile of deacon's robes and charitable donations. But the truth is like a hairline fracture. It might be invisible to the naked eye, but under enough pressure, it will eventually cause the entire structure to collapse. The air in the parking lot smells of damp asphalt and the faint metallic scent of an approaching storm, a fitting backdrop for the internal tempest that is currently tearing through my sense of identity. I spent years feeling like a disappointment because I couldn't live up to the Evans standard of effortless grace and social climbing, only to find out that the standard itself was a fabrication, a high-definition filter applied to a very messy reality. I realize now that my brother Julian's easy life was funded by the same deception, a golden life paid for with the currency of my father's shame. Every time my father looked at me with that subtle sneer of disapproval, it wasn't because I was failing, it was because I was a living, breathing reminder of a truth he couldn't control. He didn't hate my career or my modest lifestyle. He hated that he couldn't see himself in me, and rather than face that void, he chose to fill it with cruelty. Family isn't a DNA sequence or a shared last name on a piece of stationery from a high-end printer, and it certainly isn't a leverage point used to threaten the elderly. Family is supposed to be the one place where the truth doesn't require a price tag, where you can be broken and still be kept. But in the house of Marcus Evans, honesty is a liability, and loyalty is just another word for extortion. I am standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the wreckage of the last 34 years, and for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of the fall. I am only afraid of what will happen if I stay at the top and continue to breathe in the suffocating air of his lies. The deacon wants me to pray for forgiveness for my curiosity, but I am too busy preparing for the surgery that will finally cut him out of my life, no matter how much it bleeds. This isn't just about a name or a biological link. It's about the fact that the man who taught me about the sanctity of life is willing to throw his own mother to the wolves to save his pride. That is a debt no amount of money can ever settle, and it is a truth that no nursing home walls can ever truly contain. In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Cedarville, Ohio, a town where the grass is always a specific shade of emerald and the church bells ring with a precision that borders on the bureaucratic, my father, Gerald Evans, was considered the absolute gold standard of civic and moral virtue. For 22 consecutive years, he sat in the exact same spot in the front pew, left side of the Grace Bible Church, leaning forward with an expression of intense spiritual concentration that everyone in town mistook for holiness. My mother, Donna, was his shadow and his enforcer, running the seasonal church bake sales and the annual charity auctions with the terrifying precision of a drill sergeant, her clipboard always clicking with the sound of a woman who knew exactly who had donated the store-bought cookies and who had spent 4 hours over a hot stove. They lived in a sprawling 4-bedroom colonial on Heritage Way, a house that stood as a monument to their perceived success, featuring a lawn so perfectly manicured that it required a $450 monthly investment in a professional landscaping crew that arrived every Tuesday at precisely 7 in the morning. To the neighbors, the Evans family was the physical manifestation of the American dream, a portrait of stability and traditional values. But to me, standing in the kitchen of my own home and looking at my DNA results, they were nothing more than a carefully curated set of high-resolution lies. While I was out in the world, grinding through 60-hour work weeks as a registered nurse at the regional medical center, my brother Marcus was being groomed for a throne he hadn't earned, serving as a regional manager for a medical supply company where my father just happened to be on the board of directors. Marcus was the classic golden child, the one who drove a 2024 Alpine white BMW X5 that he definitely couldn't afford on his own, and who always showed up to family dinners with stories of his closing deals while I showed up with the faint scent of antiseptic still clinging to my skin. I remember one specific Sunday dinner where the contrast was so sharp, it felt like a physical weight in the room. My father was busy praising Marcus for a mediocre quarterly report while I sat there, having just come off a double shift where I'd performed CPR for 45 minutes on a man half my father's age. They didn't ask about my day. They didn't ask about the fact that I had just bought my own modest 3-bedroom ranch house at the age of 29 without a single dime of their assistance. Instead, they focused on the aesthetic of their own lives. My house was a victory of grit and overtime shifts, a property I secured with a 20% down payment saved from 5 years of working every holiday and weekend. Yet in their eyes, it was just a small, insignificant satellite orbiting their grand colonial sun. The financial reality of our family was a ledger that only I seemed to be auditing, because while my father was out dropping $300 on a single dinner to impress the church elders, I was the one who noticed that Grandma Rose's medication copays were starting to be declined at the local pharmacy. I saw the receipts. I understood the math of a lifestyle that was being funded by debt and the quiet manipulation of family assets. And yet, the town of Cedarville continued to bow to the Evans name as if it were carved in granite. My mother would stand in her designer kitchen, surrounded by $5,000 worth of Viking appliances she barely knew how to turn on, and lecture me about the importance of family loyalty and the burden of caring for an aging parent. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a way of keeping me in my place as the responsible one who handled the dirty work while they handled the applause, ensuring that I stayed quiet about the cracks I was starting to see in their pristine foundation. I was the nurse who knew the exact cost of a life-supported breath, while they were the socialites who only cared about the cost of the champagne served at the country club gala. The dynamic was always the same, a relentless push to keep me in the role of the humble servant, while Marcus was allowed to fail upward at every possible opportunity. His mistakes always smoothed over by my father's influence and my mother's strategic silence. When Marcus crashed his previous car, a 2021 Audi A6, while driving under the influence of something he'd picked up at a party, it wasn't a police report that followed. It was a quiet conversation between my father and the local sheriff, and a new car appearing in the driveway 2 weeks later. I was the one who had to listen to my mother cry about the stress Marcus was under, while I was the one who stayed up until dawn studying for my CCRN certification so I could earn an extra $4 an hour to pad my emergency fund. They had the status, the polished exterior, and the front row seat to every prestigious event in town, but I had the receipts. I had the bank statements, and I had the undeniable proof that my life was built on my own sweat, while theirs was a house of cards held together by my father's deacon robes. The landscaping at their house was a metaphor for our entire relationship, a $450 monthly facade that masked the fact that the soil underneath was depleted and the roots were rotting. Every time I walked up that perfectly edged stone walkway, I felt the cognitive dissonance of their world, where a single weed was a catastrophe, but a 30-year secret about my very existence was just something to be managed. My father would stand on that porch, looking out over his domain with a sense of entitlement that made my stomach turn, especially now that I knew he wasn't even the man the birth certificate said he was. He was a deacon of a church that preached truth, yet he lived a lie so profound it had overwritten my entire identity, and he had the audacity to threaten the one person in his life, Grandma Rose, who actually loved me without conditions. He used her like a bargaining chip in a high-stakes poker game, knowing that my nurse's heart couldn't bear to see her suffer in a low-income facility where the staff-to-patient ratio was 1:30 and the air smelled of unwashed linens. It is a strange and isolating feeling to realize that your parents are actually your greatest adversaries, people who view your independence not as a success, but as a threat to their control. My mother's precision with the bake sales wasn't about charity, it was about power, a way to ensure that everyone in Cedarville felt indebted to the Evans family, and my father's front pew presence was a calculated move to ensure no one ever questioned his integrity. They were architects of perception, building a world where Marcus could be a hero for doing nothing, and I could be a villain for simply wanting to know who I actually was. As I look at the neatly typed list of expenses I've kept for the last decade, the records of every dime I've spent on my own education, my home, and even the groceries I bought for them when my father forgot his wallet, I realize that I have been the only honest person in that colonial house for a very long time. Cedarville is the kind of place where people don't like to look too closely at the gold plating for fear of finding the lead underneath, and my family was the most heavily plated of them all. They relied on the fact that I was the good daughter, the one who followed the rules and didn't make a scene, the one who would value the family's reputation over her own peace of mind. But they underestimated the resolve of a woman who has spent 12 years in the ICU, a woman who has seen the end of life and knows that when the breathing stops, the only thing that remains is the truth of how you lived. My father can keep his manicured lawn and his front row seat at church, and my mother can keep her clipboard and her social standing, but they can no longer keep me in the dark. The contrast between our lives isn't just about money or career titles, it's about the fundamental difference between living a life of performance and living a life of purpose. I am Sienna Evans, and while I may not have the 4-bedroom colonial or the deacon's title, I have the one thing they will never possess: the courage to stand in the light of the truth, even if it burns everything else to the ground. As the sun sets over the meticulously trimmed hedges of Heritage Way, casting long, distorted shadows across the driveway where Marcus's expensive BMW sits like a trophy, I feel a cold clarity settle over me that no amount of church-sanctioned posturing can melt. I am no longer the girl who seeks validation in the quiet nods of approval from a man who uses his mother's well-being as a weapon, nor am I the woman who will allow her mother's obsession with appearances to dictate her worth. The 60-hour weeks, the exhaustion, and the solitary struggle to build a life from scratch have prepared me for this moment, giving me a backbone made of something much stronger than the fragile ego of a small-town deacon. My father thinks he is protecting a legacy, but he is actually guarding a tomb, and I am the one who is finally walking away from the graveyard of their expectations. Family is supposed to be the soil where you grow, not the cage where you are pruned into a shape that fits someone else's aesthetic, and I am done being the ornamental shrub in the Evans family garden. I have my own house now, bought with my own hands and my own honesty, and within those walls, there are no $450 monthly fees for maintenance, only the priceless comfort of knowing exactly who I am and exactly what I am worth. The receipts are all here, filed away in the quiet corners of my mind and the physical documents in my safe, and they tell a story of a woman who survived the gold standard of Cedarville to find a standard of her own that is actually made of something real. The betrayal did not arrive with a scream or a dramatic confrontation in a rainstorm. Instead, it manifested on a sweltering July 4th weekend in Cedarville, nestled right between the charred scent of the Weber charcoal grill and the heavy, mustard-laden bowls of potato salad sitting on the patio table. My sister Brooke, the family's self-appointed social director who lived for viral moments and superficial connectivity, had bounded into the backyard carrying a large shipping box containing 12 Ancestry DNA kits that she had purchased on a whim for $99 each. She presented them as a fun family activity, a way to pass the time while the fireworks prepped over the horizon. But as she began handing out the white and purple boxes, the atmosphere shifted with the sudden, jarring weight of an approaching storm. I watched my father, Gerald Evans, as a box was placed in his hand, and he didn't look at it with curiosity or the mild annoyance he usually reserved for Brooke's antics. Rather, he stared at that small cardboard package as if it were a live grenade with the pin already pulled. His knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white against the plastic wrapping, and for a fleeting second, the practiced mask of the dignified church deacon slipped, revealing a flicker of raw ancestral terror that he quickly tried to bury under a cough and a dismissive remark about corporate data mining. I remember the heat of that afternoon vividly, the way my nursing scrubs felt like a second skin even on my day off, and the way the condensation dripped off my glass of iced tea as I watched everyone spit into the small plastic vials with a sense of oblivious excitement. 3 weeks later, the physical heat of July had faded into the humid, heavy air of August, and I was finishing a grueling shift at the hospital when my iPhone buzzed on the nightstand with a notification that shattered the quiet of my bedroom. I opened the app, expecting to see a long list of distant cousins and mundane heritage percentages, but instead, the screen displayed a 25.3% DNA match to a user identified only as Nathan H., a match categorized unequivocally as a half-brother. My heart performed a slow, sickening roll in my chest as I realized that the biological map of my life had just been redrawn by a stranger in a database I hadn't even wanted to join. When I went to the colonial house on Heritage Way to confront my father, hoping for some shred of a logical explanation or perhaps a story of a youthful indiscretion he had long since regretted, I didn't find a man seeking forgiveness. I found a man who didn't even bother to ask who Nathan was or how he was doing. Instead, his first words were a hissed demand of how the hell that boy was in the system, a reaction that confirmed he hadn't just known about this brother. He had actively tried to ensure he remained a ghost. The conversation that followed was the coldest experience of my 34 years, taking place in the kitchen while my mother was out at a committee meeting, the hum of the high-end refrigerator providing a mechanical underscoring to the destruction of my family's integrity. When I looked him in the eye and told him that I had already received a message from Nathan and that I had no intention of ignoring the man who shared my blood, My father didn't resort to the scripture he loved to quote or the moral platitudes he used to keep the congregation in line. He reached for his ultimate card, a weapon so cruel it made the air in the room feel thin and toxic, and he calmly informed me that he still co-owned the small yellow bungalow where my grandmother Ruth had lived for over 50 years. He told me, with the same flat tone he used to discuss the $450 monthly landscaping bill, that if I chose to pursue a relationship with this stranger, he would exercise his legal right to force a sale of her home. He described the next step with a calculated malice that made my blood run cold, explaining that he would use the proceeds to move her to Pine Ridge, a state-funded facility on the edge of town that possessed a staggering 2.1 star rating on every review site and a reputation for a smell that was a permanent mixture of industrial bleach and human despair. He knew that Grandma Ruth was the only person who had ever truly seen me, the woman who had tucked my college graduation photos into the frame of her vanity mirror while my father had buried them in a drawer, and he was willing to sacrifice her dignity to protect his 30-year-old lie. I stood there, clutching the edge of the granite countertop that he had paid for with the fruits of his perceived righteousness, and I realized that the man standing before me was a stranger I had been conditioned to honor. The contrast between his public persona as a pillar of the Cedarville community and the private monster willing to exile his own mother to a house of neglect was so sharp, it felt like a physical wound. He wasn't worried about the family's soul. He was worried about the balance sheet of his reputation, a ledger he was willing to balance with the currency of my grandmother's suffering and my brother's erasure. He looked at me with those cold deacon's eyes and told me that family was about loyalty, but what he meant was that family was a contract of silence, and I was currently in breach. The technicality of his threat was what hurt the most. The fact that he had kept his name on her deed for decades, specifically for a moment like this, a strategic insurance policy against any truth that might threaten his standing. I thought of the 60-hour weeks I worked, the way I carefully monitored my patients' vital signs and advocated for their comfort, while my own father was planning to strip the comfort from the woman who had taught me how to be kind. Pine Ridge wasn't just a nursing home, it was a warehouse for the forgotten, a place where the staff-to-patient ratio was a disaster and where the call bells often went unanswered for hours in the dark. To even mention that place in the same breath as Grandma Ruth was an act of psychological warfare, a way of telling me that my conscience would be responsible for her demise if I didn't delete the app and the brother it had revealed. He was betting on my nurse's heart to be my greatest weakness, believing that the empathy I felt for others would force me back into the shadow of his deception. Every detail of that July 4th weekend now felt like a staged performance, from the way he flipped the burgers on the grill to the way he led the prayer before we ate. It was all a frantic attempt to keep the lid on a boiling pot of secrets. Brooke's $99 kits had done more than just trace our lineage. They had acted as a chemical reagent, stripping away the gold plating from the Evans name and showing the corrosive greed and fear underneath. I sat in my car afterward, the engine idling and the air conditioning blasting against the August heat, and I looked at the message from Nathan H. sitting in my inbox, a simple hello that had cost me the father I thought I knew. I realized then that my father's gold standard was actually a form of debt, a mortgage on our souls that he expected us to pay off with our silence and our complicity. He was a man who understood the market value of a colonial house on a manicured lot, but he had absolutely no concept of the worth of a human being's right to their own history. The smell of the charcoal from that weekend seemed to linger in my hair for days, a constant reminder of the bridge that had been burned between the girl I was and the woman I was becoming. I thought about the $450 he spent on his lawn every month and contrasted it with the budget cuts and neglect at Pine Ridge, realizing that his priorities were always about the surface, never the substance. My father had built an empire of appearances, a world where the grass was always cut to 2 inches and the sins were always swept under the expensive Persian rugs, but he had forgotten that some truths are biological, written into the very marrow of our bones. He could sell the house, he could move the furniture, and he could threaten the woman who gave him life. But he could not unmap the DNA that linked me to a brother he had tried to bury. He thought he was playing a winning hand by using Grandma Ruth as leverage, but he didn't realize that a nurse knows exactly how to handle a crisis. We don't panic when the pressure rises, we stabilize and we plan. As I drove away from the colonial house, past the neighbors who waved at the deacon's daughter with practiced smiles, I felt a sense of profound isolation that no amount of church-going could ever cure. I was the daughter of a man who viewed his family as a collection of assets to be managed and his secrets as liabilities to be liquidated at any cost. The contrast between the life he projected and the reality of his threats was a chasm I could no longer bridge, and the silence he demanded was a price I was no longer willing to pay. I would find a way to protect Grandma Ruth, and I would find a way to meet Nathan, because the truth isn't something you can delete with a finger swipe on a polished screen. It is a living, breathing thing, and unlike my father's reputation, it doesn't require a $99 kit or a manicured lawn to be real. It only requires the courage to look at the bleach-scented darkness and refuse to let it swallow the people you love. My father might hold the deed to the house, but he no longer holds the deed to my life, and that is a receipt he was never prepared to handle. The fireworks of July 4th had long since faded, but the fire they started in my life was just beginning to burn, illuminating the cracks in the colonial facade and showing me exactly where the exit was. Family isn't who you're forced to protect at the expense of your soul. It's who you're willing to fight for when the gold standard turns out to be nothing but lead. I sat in my kitchen at precisely 2:14 in the morning, the heavy silence of the house amplified by the low, insistent hum of my stainless steel Samsung refrigerator and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock that seemed to mark the final seconds of the woman I used to be. I was still wearing my seal blue fig scrubs, the fabric wrinkled and stained with the invisible residue of a 12-hour shift at County General, but I was too wired to sleep, too consumed by the digital bridge I was currently crossing to care about the exhaustion deep in my marrow. Propped up against a half-empty bottle of overpriced sparkling water on my quartz countertop was my phone, its screen glowing with the pixelated image of a man named Nathan, a 31-year-old carpenter from Briarfield who was currently sitting in a dimly lit kitchen miles away. As the video buffered for a second, I found myself tracing the lines of his face with my eyes, and a cold shiver of recognition raced down my spine because there was no need for a laboratory or a $99 saliva kit to confirm what was staring back at me. Nathan possessed the exact same architectural square jaw and the deep, distinctive cleft chin that my father, Gerald Evans, carried with such arrogant pride every Sunday morning at Grace Bible Church. Seeing those features on a stranger's face, softened by a genuine, weary smile rather than the frozen mask of a deacon's authority, was like seeing a ghost step out of a dark room and into the light of a common kitchen. Nathan was speaking in a low, hushed tone, careful not to wake his 5-year-old daughter Lily, who was asleep in the other room of their 900-square-foot apartment, a space that cost him $1,100 a month in a town where the cost of living was rising faster than his hourly wage. He told me about his life, about the sawdust that lived under his fingernails and the way he had been raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs and never spoke the name of the man who had walked away before the pregnancy test was even dry. He wasn't looking for a handout or a piece of the Evans colonial estate. He was just looking for the other half of his own story. A man who had spent 3 decades wondering why he felt like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong box. As I looked at the chipped paint on the wall behind him and the modest, cluttered reality of his life, I felt a wave of profound, white-hot fury directed toward the man on Heritage Way. My father had spent $450 a month on professional landscaping just to ensure the neighbors thought his life was perfect, while his own flesh and blood was counting pennies in a cramped apartment, ignored and erased to preserve the sanctity of a brand. It wasn't about protecting my mother's feelings or the church's reputation. It was about a man who was so addicted to the image of his own righteousness that he was willing to treat human beings like disposable assets in a corporate merger. The contrast between Nathan's struggle and my brother Marcus's unearned luxury was so stark, it felt like a physical blow to the chest, a jagged edge that cut through the last remnants of my familial loyalty. While Marcus was out crashing $2,000 sets of golf clubs and driving a luxury SUV funded by my father's business loans, Nathan was calculating the cost of Lily's new school shoes and the price of a gallon of milk. My father had built a fortress of lies and called it a family, using the deacon's pulpit as a shield and Grandma Ruth's bungalow as a ransom note. But as I looked at Nathan's kind, tired eyes, I realized that I was done being a hostage. I had spent 34 years playing the role of the responsible daughter, the nurse who fixed the problems and kept the peace and never asked for a dime, believing that my sacrifice was the glue holding the Evans name together. But looking at Nathan, I understood that I wasn't the glue. I was the silence, and my silence was the only thing allowing my father's cruelty to thrive. The responsible daughter who worked 60-hour weeks to prove her worth to a man who had no concept of value was officially off duty, and the woman who took her place was finished with the business of protecting a brand that was built on a foundation of betrayal. I watched as Nathan shifted his phone, giving me a glimpse of a small, colorful drawing Lily had made, which was taped to his refrigerator with a cheap butterfly magnet. And I thought about the thousands of dollars my father spent on original oil paintings for his mahogany-paneled study. My father's world was a museum of expensive things meant to distract from the poverty of his soul, while Nathan's world was a small, cramped space overflowing with the kind of raw, honest love that my father couldn't even begin to comprehend. Love isn't a loyalty test where the price of entry is your integrity or your silence, and it certainly isn't something that can be threatened away with the sale of a grandmother's house. Gerald Evans had spent my entire life teaching me about the gold standard, but as I sat in the blue-tinted light of my kitchen at 2 a.m, I realized that Nathan, with his sawdust and his 900-square-foot apartment and his 5-year-old daughter, was the only thing in this entire mess that was actually made of gold. My father thought he was the architect of my life, but he was really just a landlord who had been overcharging me for a room in a house that was never meant to be a home. The realization brought a cold, sharp clarity that felt like the snap of a surgical glove, a readiness for the procedure that was about to follow. I looked at the clock again, 2:21 now, and I felt a sense of liberation that was almost terrifying in its intensity, a shedding of the weight I had carried since I was a little girl, trying to earn a smile from a man who was already looking past me toward the next social engagement. I told Nathan that I was coming to see him, that I didn't care about the deacon's threats or the colonial house or the $450 lawn, and that we were going to find a way to make things right for Grandma Ruth without bowing to the monster in the Brooks Brothers blazer. I could see the relief wash over his face, a mirror of my own jawline tightening with a new kind of resolve, and I knew that the Evans family brand was about to face its first real audit. My father had played his ultimate card by threatening to move Grandma to Pine Ridge, a facility with a 2.1 star rating and the smell of bleach and despair. But he had forgotten that I was a nurse who had navigated the most complex medical and social crises imaginable. I knew how to fight for my patients, and I certainly knew how to fight for the woman who had actually loved me when my parents were too busy polishing their pedestals. The kitchen around me felt different now, no longer a place of quiet contemplation, but a command center for the war that was coming, a space where the responsible nurse was transforming into a daughter of the truth. I looked at my hands, the hands that had just finished a grueling shift of saving strangers, and I realized they were perfectly suited for the task of dismantling a 30-year-old lie, piece by piece. My father wanted me to choose a stranger over my own blood, but the irony was that the stranger was the man I had lived with for 34 years, and my own blood was the carpenter in Briarfield who didn't even know he had a sister until a $99 kit changed everything. The deacon could keep his front row seat and his manicured lawn and his golden sun, because I was taking the cleft chin and the square jaw and the truth, and I was walking out of the Colonial Museum forever. There would be no more 60-hour weeks dedicated to making him proud, no more quiet nods of agreement during his lectures on morality, and no more fear of the budget nursing home he used as a weapon. As the video call ended and the screen went black, I sat for a long moment in the stillness, the blue light of the kitchen windows signaling the very early approach of a new day that my father would not be able to control. I thought about the bleach-scented hallways of Pine Ridge and the manicured grass of Heritage Way, and I realized they were just two different kinds of prisons, and I was holding the keys to both. My name is Sienna Evans, and for the first time in my life, that name didn't feel like a debt I had to repay with my soul. It felt like a declaration of independence written in the same DNA that my father had tried so desperately to erase. I was no longer the invisible daughter or the reliable backup plan. I was a woman who had seen the receipts of her father's life and found them to be fraudulent, and I was ready to close the account once and for all. The responsible one was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that true responsibility wasn't about following the rules of a liar, but about honoring the humanity of the people he had cast aside. The battle for Grandma Ruth's dignity and Nathan's recognition was only just beginning, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the cost of the landscaping. I was only focused on the beauty of the truth that was finally starting to grow through the cracks in the Evans family gold. I stood up, the floorboards of my modest house firm beneath my feet, and I didn't feel the exhaustion of the shift anymore. I only felt the power of a woman who had finally decided to stop living someone else's performance and start living her own reality, no matter how many stars the reviews gave her for it. I did not seek out a high-priced attorney in a glass-walled office to handle the systematic dismantling of my father's life. Instead, I went directly to the one source of truth that Gerald Evans had spent decades trying to suppress through financial intimidation and psychological warfare. At exactly 11:45 p.m., the moonlight reflecting off the hood of my 2021 Toyota RAV4 as I pulled into the familiar, cracked driveway of the small yellow bungalow, I found my grandmother Ruth waiting for me in her floral armchair, the soft glow of a single brass floor lamp illuminating the resolve in her weary eyes. She didn't offer the usual pleasantries about my nursing shifts or the weather in Cedarville, rather. She reached beneath the cushion of her chair and produced a heavy manila envelope, yellowed at the edges and smelling faintly of cedar chips and long-forgotten secrets, a collection she simply referred to as the arsenal. As I sat at her small kitchen table, the linoleum cold beneath my feet, I emptied the contents of that envelope and felt the weight of 30 years of deception finally begin to shift from my shoulders to the floor. Inside was a wallet-sized photograph, the colors faded but the image unmistakable, showing a 23-month-old Nathan with that same distinctive Evans jawline and a tuft of unruly dark hair that mirrored the baby pictures of my brother Marcus. Tucked behind the photo was a formal bank portrait of my father from 1994, taken during his tenure as a junior executive at the First National Bank, a time when he wore a cheap polyester suit and a smile that hadn't yet been hardened by the absolute power of his current deaconship. The most damning piece of evidence in the arsenal was a 3-page letter, handwritten on lined notebook paper and signed by a woman named Karen Holt, a former bank teller whose name had been scrubbed from our family's oral history like a stain on an expensive rug. The letter detailed the exact moment my father's double life had collided with his professional one, describing a cold Tuesday afternoon in November when he had cornered her in the vault and delivered a terrifying ultimatum of hush or quit after she discovered the irregular transfers he was making to a private account in Briarfield. Karen Holt had written this letter as a form of insurance, a desperate attempt to document the truth before she was forced out of her career by a man who used his rising status in the church as a weapon against anyone who dared to notice his flaws. Reading her words, I realized that my father's transition from a struggling bank employee to a pillar of the community hadn't been a journey of faith, but a calculated series of silences bought with threats and the quiet liquidation of my grandmother's trust. Grandma Ruth sat across from me, her hands folded over her cane, and explained that she had kept these documents hidden for 3 decades because she knew that one day the gold plating on Gerald's reputation would finally begin to flake away. And she wanted to ensure that when the truth came out, it would be undeniable. To supplement Karen's testimony and the photographic proof, we laid out the DNA certificates I had printed earlier that evening. 3 identical matches from 3 separate ancestry kits that provided a mathematical and biological certainty that no amount of theological posturing could refute. The numbers on the page were stark and clinical, a 25.3% match to Nathan H. appearing on every single report, a constant variable in an equation my father had spent a lifetime trying to unbalance. I felt a strange sense of professional calm wash over me, the same clinical focus I used when a patient's vitals were crashing in the ICU, because I realized that the evidence before me was no longer a matter of opinion or family loyalty. It was a biological fact. My father had threatened to sell this very house and move Grandma Ruth to the bleach-scented misery of Pine Ridge with its 2.1 star rating, but he had forgotten that a man who builds his house on threats is always one piece of paper away from a total collapse. The arsenal wasn't just a collection of old photos and letters. It was the forensic evidence of a crime against 2 families, a map of the lives he had discarded to ensure he could sit in that front pew every Sunday without a hint of shadow on his face. The air in the small kitchen felt thick with the presence of the woman my father had silenced, and as I traced the signature of Karen Holt, I felt an intense connection to the strangers he had trampled in his ascent to small-town royalty. I thought about Nathan in his 900-square-foot apartment, raising Lily alone and working with sawdust under his fingernails, while my father spent $450 a month on a professional landscaping crew to trim the hedges at a colonial house built on the back of Karen's forced resignation. The contrast was no longer just a source of personal resentment. It was a call to action for the daughter who was officially off duty from the business of protecting a liar. My father believed that his co-ownership of Grandma Ruth's bungalow gave him the ultimate leverage, but he hadn't accounted for the fact that a nurse knows exactly how to identify a lethal pathogen and isolate it before it can destroy the entire system. We spent the next hour meticulously organizing the documents, placing the DNA certificates on top of the 1994 bank photo and the letter from Karen Holt, creating a chronological record of a man who had traded his soul for a deacon's title and a manicured lawn. Grandma Ruth's voice was steady as she told me that she was no longer afraid of Pine Ridge or the loss of her home, because the weight of the secret had become more burdensome than the prospect of poverty. She had watched my father grow into a man who valued the brand of the Evans family over the heartbeat of the people within it, and she was ready to see the brand burned to the ground if it meant that Nathan could finally take his rightful place in the light. I looked at the 3 identical matches on the DNA reports and realized that the science of our blood was the only thing in this life that Gerald Evans couldn't buy, manipulate, or threaten into silence. It was a biological constant that didn't care about his $500,000 donation to the church or his position on the regional hospital board. It was simply the truth, expressed in the elegant, unyielding language of nucleotides. The evidence was mathematical, a sequence of data points that linked a carpenter in Briarfield to a nurse in Cedarville and a deacon on Heritage Way in a way that no lawyer could ever argue away. As I packed the manila envelope back into my nursing bag, I felt a sense of finality that was as sharp as a scalpel, a realization that the 34-year performance was reaching its final act. My father had played his ultimate card by using Grandma Ruth as a bargaining chip, but he had failed to realize that the grandmother he sought to exploit was the one who held the keys to his undoing all along. I drove home through the quiet streets of Cedarville, passing the dark silhouette of the Grace Bible Church, where my father's name was engraved on a brass plate in the foyer, and I didn't feel the old familiar pang of guilt or the urge to be the responsible daughter who smoothed things over. I felt the cold, hard resolve of a woman who was carrying the arsenal, a woman who knew that by tomorrow morning, the gold standard of Gerald Evans would be revealed as nothing more than polished lead. The smell of the old paper and the image of little Nathan's face stayed with me as I walked into my own home. A house that was paid for with honest work and 60-hour weeks. A place where the truth didn't require a manila envelope to be safe. I thought about the letter from Karen Holt and the way her handwriting shook toward the end of the 3rd page, a physical manifestation of the fear my father had instilled in her decades ago. He had silenced her with a hush or quit ultimatum, believing that a teller at a local bank was a small enough person to be erased without a trace. But he had underestimated the enduring power of a woman's memory and the meticulous nature of his own mother. Grandma Ruth had been a silent witness for 30 years, watching him transform from a man of hidden debts into a man of public piety, and she had waited with the patience of a saint for the moment when her granddaughter would finally be strong enough to carry the truth. The evidence was biological because our blood didn't lie. It was mathematical because the percentages were undeniable, and it was undeniably the end of the Evans family brand as the town of Cedarville knew it. The deacon would soon find out that a 2.1 star rating at a nursing home was the least of his worries, because the audit of his life was officially beginning, and the lead auditor was the daughter he had tried to ransom. I sat on my own porch for a moment, looking up at the stars and breathing in the cool night air, realizing that the truth isn't just a set of facts, it's a form of oxygen that allows you to finally breathe after years of suffocation. My father's empire of appearances was about to meet the reality of the manila envelope, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the noise the collapse would make. I was only looking forward to the silence that would follow. A silence that wasn't bought with threats or built on lies, but a quiet, honest space where Nathan, Lily, Grandma Ruth, and I could finally exist without the shadow of the deacon's disapproval. The arsenal was ready, the nurse was on call, and the gold standard was about to be officially decommissioned in the eyes of the only people who actually mattered. I went inside and closed the door, the weight of the manila envelope a comforting presence in my hand, a reminder that the truth is the only legacy worth protecting, no matter how many manicured lawns you have to dig up to find it. The mandatory family dinner scheduled for the following Saturday was not a meal so much as it was a carefully choreographed judicial proceeding, a grand theater of intimidation orchestrated by my father to re-establish his crumbling hegemony over the Evans legacy. 22 people, the entire extended clan of aunts, uncles, and cousins who viewed Gerald Evans as the ultimate patriarch, were gathered around the oversized mahogany table in the colonial dining room, a space illuminated by a $2,000 Swarovski crystal chandelier that cast sharp, cold light onto the Noritake platinum-rimmed china. My mother, Donna, had spent the entire morning directing a catering crew to ensure every crystal water goblet was polished to a mirror finish and every linen napkin was folded into a crisp architectural pyramid, creating a facade of domestic perfection that felt increasingly like a burial shroud. I sat near the foot of the table, still feeling the phantom weight of my stethoscope around my neck from a morning shift, watching as my father took his seat at the head of the table with the practiced, somber dignity of a man about to deliver a sermon from the Mount. The air in the room was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary chicken and the unspoken tension of a family that knew something was rotting beneath the floorboards but was too terrified of the smell to investigate. My father waited until the first course was cleared, his hands folded over the white tablecloth with a stillness that was meant to command absolute reverence, before he launched into what I had come to call his deacon's speech, a masterclass in rhetorical manipulation and spiritual gaslighting. He began by clearing his throat, a resonant baritone sound that silenced the clinking of silverware, and spoke of the sanctity of the home and the modern dangers of what he called unreliable fantasies provided by profit-driven corporations. He didn't use the word DNA. Instead, he referred to the results as digital delusions and statistical anomalies, framing my discovery of Nathan as a personal failing, a symptom of my supposed bitterness and a lack of faith in the family that had provided for me. He looked directly at me, his eyes two cold chips of flint behind his designer frames, and demanded that I stand before the 22 witnesses present and apologize to my mother for tearing the home apart with my baseless accusations. He spoke about the $450 monthly landscaping bill, the church donations, and the reputation he had spent 30 years building, as if those receipts were enough to overwrite the biological reality of the half-brother he had abandoned to a 900-square-foot apartment in Briarfield. The room was silent, the kind of suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic failure in an ICU ward, as the aunts and uncles nodded in solemn agreement, conditioned by decades of my father's authority to view any dissent as heresy. My brother Marcus sat to my father's right, looking smug in a $500 tailored vest, the golden child basking in the reflected glow of a patriarch who was currently crucifying his sister to protect his own brand. My father's voice rose in pitch and fervor, quoting a verse about honoring one's parents while his finger pointed toward me like a spear, insisting that I delete the Ancestry app and renounce the stranger I had contacted if I ever wanted to be welcomed at this table again. He looked truly righteous in that moment, the undisputed king of Heritage Way, a man who believed that if he shouted the lie loud enough and decorated it with enough expensive china, the truth would simply wither away and die. But he had forgotten one crucial variable in his equation of control, a variable that didn't care about his status in the church or the platinum rim on his plates, and that variable was currently standing on the other side of the heavy oak front door. Then, the heavy silence of the dining room was shattered by the distinct rhythmic creak of the front door hinges, a sound that shouldn't have happened because the catering staff had been instructed to use the side entrance. Every head at the table turned as the door swung open, and the cold evening air from the manicured lawn rushed into the heated room, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and the reality my father had tried to lock outside. Grandma Ruth walked in, uninvited and unannounced, her small frame leaning heavily on her silver-topped cane, her breath hitching slightly from the effort of the walk. Yet she carried an aura of such absolute, undeniable gravity that the Swarovski chandelier seemed to dim in her presence. She wasn't wearing the designer silk my mother had bought for her. She was in her old navy blue cardigan and her sensible orthopedic shoes, and clutched tightly against her chest was the yellowed manila envelope, the arsenal that contained 30 years of suppressed history. My father's face transitioned from a mask of righteous anger to a pale, sickly shade of gray as he watched his 78-year-old mother navigate the room, her eyes fixed not on the guests, but on the son who had threatened to exile her to a 2.1-star nursing home. She didn't wait for him to speak or for my mother to offer her a chair. Instead, she walked directly to the head of the table and placed that manila envelope right on top of his empty gold-rimmed plate, the sound of the paper hitting the porcelain echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She looked at the 22 people gathered there, her voice steady and clear, free of the tremors that usually plagued her, and she told them that if they wanted to talk about honoring parents, they should start by looking at the evidence of a man who would trade his own flesh and blood for a seat in the front pew. She reached into the envelope and pulled out the wallet-sized photo of 23-month-old Nathan, the baby with the Evans jawline, and slid it down the long mahogany table like a card in a high-stakes game. My father tried to stand, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, his mouth opening to deliver another theological rebuke, but the words died in his throat when Grandma Ruth pulled out the 3-page letter from Karen Holt, the teller he had silenced in 1994 with a hush or quit ultimatum. The responsible daughter was gone, and as I watched Grandma Ruth systematically dismantle the Evans brand with the contents of that yellowed envelope, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any I had known in 34 years. This wasn't a family dinner anymore, it was a forensic audit of a soul, and the auditor was a woman who had spent 3 decades keeping the receipts while her son spent his life trying to burn them. My mother reached for her wine glass, her hand shaking so violently that the red liquid splashed onto the white linen tablecloth, a vivid crimson stain that looked exactly like a fresh wound in the middle of her perfect landscape. Grandma Ruth didn't stop until every DNA certificate, every bank record, and every photograph was laid bare on that table for the aunts, the uncles, and the cousins to see, stripping away the gold plating from my father's reputation until there was nothing left but the lead of his cowardice. The deacon of Grace Bible Church was suddenly just a man sitting at a table surrounded by the evidence of his own cruelty. A man who had used a $99 kit and a 3-page letter to prove that his entire life was a 4-bedroom colonial built on a foundation of extortion. The contrast between the deacon's speech he had just delivered and the reality of Karen Holt's letter was a chasm that no amount of church donations could ever bridge, and for the first time in my life, I saw the fear in my father's eyes, the raw animal terror of a brand that has been permanently tarnished. He had threatened to move his mother to Pine Ridge, a place that smelled of bleach and despair, to keep this moment from happening. But he had underestimated the strength of the woman who had raised him. Grandma Ruth leaned over the table, her face inches from his, and told him in a whisper that could be heard in every corner of the room that the house on Heritage Way might belong to him. But the truth belonged to the children he had tried to erase. I stood up then, not to apologize, but to take my place beside the grandmother who had saved me, leaving my pristine plate and my role as the invisible daughter behind on the platinum-rimmed china. The 22 guests were no longer nodding in agreement. They were staring at the photographs and the DNA matches with a horrified fascination, realizing that the pillar of their community was a man who had engineered a 30-year deception at the expense of his own mother's peace. The manicured lawn outside, the $450 a month facade, meant nothing now that the interior of the house was filled with the voices of the people Gerald Evans had tried to silence. My name is Sienna Evans, and as I walked out of that dining room with my grandmother on my arm, I realized that the responsible daughter hadn't just gone off duty, she had been promoted to the role of the truth-teller. We left the manila envelope on the table for them to finish reading, a paper trail of a broken legacy that no amount of professional landscaping could ever fix. As we crossed the threshold and walked out into the cool Ohio night, I didn't look back at the colonial house or the Swarovski light. I only looked forward to the 900-square-foot apartment in Briarfield, where a carpenter and a 5-year-old girl were waiting for the rest of their family to finally come home. Family isn't a brand you protect with threats and china. It's the courage to stand at a table full of lies and lay down the truth, even if it means the gold standard never shines the same way again. The audit was over, the receipts were validated, and for the first time in 34 years, the air I breathed didn't taste like my father's permission. It tasted like freedom. The execution was not a chaotic explosion of emotion, but a surgical debridement of a 30-year-old infection, a process so precise and cold that it stripped the oxygen right out of the Evans dining room. Grandma Ruth did not sit in the chair my mother hurriedly offered in a panic. Instead, she claimed the high-backed velvet host chair that had been vacated by my brother Marcus, and she looked at the 22 gathered relatives with a gaze that had been sharpened by decades of quiet observation. She cleared her throat, a sound that cut through my father's sputtered attempts at a defense, and she told the room in a voice that didn't waver once that she was 78 years old, and she was tired of being called crazy or senile just to protect the reputation of a coward. The weight of her words landed like a physical blow against the mahogany table, and before my father could regain his breath to launch another scripture-heavy rebuttal, I stepped forward and began to lay the arsenal out on the pristine white tablecloth right next to the silver bread basket filled with artisanal rolls. I started with the DNA certificates, the crisp white paper contrasting sharply with the deep wood of the table, and I read the numbers aloud with the same clinical, detached tone I used when reporting a patient's deteriorating vitals during a shift change. I stated the percentages clearly so that everyone from the back of the room to the head of the table could hear the mathematical finality of our blood. 25.3% for Nathan, 25.1% for a second match we had uncovered in a neighboring county, and 24.8% for a third, 3 children from 3 different women, all carrying the unmistakable genetic signature of the man sitting in the front pew of Grace Bible Church. The room descended into what we call structural silence in the medical field, the kind of heavy, absolute quiet that happens right before a building collapses or a heart stops beating. A silence so profound that the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the $1,200 Howard Miller grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to grow to a deafening roar. In that vacuum of sound, the social fabric of the Evans family began to fray in real time as Aunt June, my mother's lifelong confidant and the town's primary socialite, slowly and deliberately took her hand off my mother's trembling arm as if the very touch might contaminate her own standing. Uncle Harold, a man who had spent 20 years nodding in agreement with every one of my father's business tips, couldn't even bring himself to look up, staring instead at the polished hardwood floor as if he were trying to find an exit strategy in the grain of the oak. My father, the man who had controlled every room he had ever walked into with a mixture of practiced baritone and financial intimidation, suddenly looked like a man standing on a trapdoor with the lever already pulled halfway. The righteous mask he had worn for 30 years, the deacon's dignity, the regional manager's confidence, the patriarch's authority, was melting away under the fluorescent glare of the truth, leaving behind a small, frightened man who realized that his $450 monthly landscaping bill couldn't hide the rot in the soil of his own soul. I didn't stop with the numbers. I laid out the 1994 bank photo of him looking young and culpable, and I placed Karen Holt's 3-page handwritten letter directly on top of his gold-rimmed dessert plate so he would have to look at her words while he processed his own undoing. I watched his eyes dart from the letter to the DNA matches and back to the silent faces of his siblings and friends. And for the first time in my 34 years, I didn't feel the urge to fix it. I didn't feel the responsible daughter's reflex to smooth over the conflict or provide a cushion for his fall. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a nurse who has finally stabilized a chaotic environment by removing the source of the trauma, regardless of how much the patient screamed during the procedure. The contrast between the deacon's speech he had delivered 10 minutes prior and the biological and documentary evidence on the table was so absolute that not even my mother's most loyal supporters could find a way to bridge the gap. My mother, Donna, was staring at the red wine stain on the white linen, her face a pale, frozen mask of realization that the perfect family she had managed like a drill sergeant was actually a collection of strangers held together by the threat of Grandma Ruth's exile. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, a sharp metallic ring that seemed to signal the end of an era on Heritage Way. And as the sound faded, the structural silence was replaced by the low, murmuring sound of the relatives beginning to whisper to one another. They weren't looking at my father with reverence anymore. They were looking at him with the voyeuristic horror one reserves for a car wreck, realizing that the man who had lectured them on morality for 2 decades was a serial deceiver who used his own mother's home as a bargaining chip for his secrets. Gerald Evans sat there, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard that the platinum-rimmed china rattled. But he didn't speak, because there were no more scriptures to twist and no more threats that could reach us now that the arsenal was in the hands of the entire family. I looked at the silver bread basket and the fine crystal and the 22 people who had spent their lives believing in a brand, and I realized that the setup my father had intended as my public shaming had become his own public execution. The execution was surgical because it targeted exactly what he valued most: his reputation, his standing in the church, and his ability to manipulate the narrative of our lives. By bringing the strangers he had fathered into the light of the dining room, I had rendered his 4-bedroom colonial and his manicured lawn irrelevant, turning his monument of success into a museum of his betrayals. Aunt June's withdrawal was the most telling sign of the shift in power, a social death sentence delivered in the middle of a dinner party, proving that once the gold standard is revealed as lead, no amount of Noritake china can make it valuable again. Uncle Harold's refusal to meet my father's eyes was the final nail in the coffin of his authority, a silent acknowledgement that the business deals and the social hierarchy were all built on a foundation of fraud that none of them were willing to support any longer. I stood by Grandma Ruth's side, my hand on the back of her chair, feeling the strength of her resolve flowing into me like a transfusion, and I knew that the responsible daughter had done the most responsible thing of all. She had told the truth. My father looked up at me then, and for a fleeting second, the cold deacon's eyes were gone, replaced by the hollow, empty gaze of a man who had lost his leverage and his legacy in the span of a single meal. He looked at the 25.3% on Nathan's certificate and the 2.1 star rating I had printed out for Pine Ridge, and he realized that the nurse he had tried to intimidate was far better at managing a crisis than he was at creating one. The silence in the hallway, punctuated only by the $1,200 clock, was the sound of the Evans family brand finally going bankrupt, leaving behind only the raw biological reality of the children he had tried to erase and the mother he had tried to discard. I didn't need to say another word, because the evidence was mathematical. The witnesses were legion, and the deacon was officially out of miracles. The air in the room, once thick with the smell of rosemary chicken and expensive perfume, now felt thin and sterile, the atmosphere of an operating room after a difficult surgery where the outcome is certain, but the recovery is a long way off. I looked at the 3 children, the 3 matches, the 3 lives my father had tried to treat as liabilities, and I felt a sense of fierce, protective love for the strangers who shared my cleft chin and my square jaw. My father's attempt to use my mother's fragile mental health as a shield had failed because even she could no longer deny the evidence laid out next to the breadbasket, her silent tears finally washing away the makeup of her drill sergeant persona. We had dismantled the colonial fortress from the inside out, using the very table where he had demanded my apology as the altar for his own confession, and as the ticking of the clock continued to mark the time, I knew that none of us would ever be the same. The gold standard of Cedarville was lying in pieces on the mahogany, and as I looked at the trapdoor my father was standing on, I realized that I wasn't the one who had pulled the lever. He had done it himself 30 years ago, and I was just the one who finally let him fall. I began to gather the papers, not because the job was done, but because the evidence had already served its purpose. The truth now etched into the memories of everyone at the table in a way that no retraction could ever fix. Grandma Ruth stood up, her cane clicking firmly against the hardwood as she prepared to leave the house she had helped build for a man who didn't deserve it. And I followed her out of the room without a backward glance at the deacon or his golden son. The structural silence remained behind us, a heavy, suffocating weight that would linger in that colonial house long after the Noritake china was packed away and the Swarovski light was turned off for the final time. We walked out through the front door, past the $450 a month lawn and the 2023 midnight black Escalade, and we didn't look back at the brand that had been surgically removed from our lives. My name is Sienna Evans, and while I may have been the one to deliver the final blow, the truth was the only weapon I needed to ensure that the gold standard of my father would never be used as a currency in our family again. The clock in the hallway continued to tick, but for the first time in 34 years, it wasn't counting down to the next lie. It was marking the first minutes of our lives lived in the light of the mathematical, biological, and undeniable truth. The fallout from that catastrophic Saturday dinner was total and absolute, a systemic collapse that no amount of social maneuvering or theological posturing from Gerald Evans could possibly contain. My father did not sell Grandmother Ruth's yellow bungalow, nor did he ever mention the name of Pine Ridge again, because the surgical strike we delivered that night didn't just expose a secret. It activated a series of legal and social repercussions that stripped him of every ounce of leverage he had spent 30 years accumulating. The implications of elder abuse, specifically the documented threat to move a 78-year-old woman into a substandard facility as a form of extortion to protect a personal secret, reached the ears of the Grace Bible Church Elder Board within 48 hours of the dinner. The community that once viewed him as a gold standard suddenly saw him as a liability, a man whose private cruelty made his public piety look like a grotesque parody. By Monday afternoon, my father had composed a brief 3-paragraph email addressed to the senior pastor and the board of deacons, resigning from his position effective immediately, citing personal family matters that required his full attention, though everyone in Cedarville knew the truth was far more sordid than his vague corporate phrasing suggested. The church board didn't ask him to stay, and the regional hospital board, where he had once held a seat of considerable influence, quietly removed his name from the upcoming gala invitation list, an erasure that hit him harder than any financial penalty ever could. I watched from the sidelines as the 2023 Midnight Black Escalade remained parked in the driveway of the 4-bedroom colonial for days on end, the professional landscaping crew still arriving every Tuesday at 7 in the morning to trim the hedges of a house that had become a silent, velvet-lined prison for the man who once ruled it. My mother, Donna, stopped answering the door for the bake sale committees and the charity organizers, her drill sergeant precision failing her as she realized that the social brand she had curated so carefully was now a cautionary tale whispered over coffee at the local diners. The contrast was staggering. While my parents retreated into a fortress of shame, the people they had tried to erase were finally stepping into the sunlight of a reality that wasn't bought with lies or maintained with $450 monthly maintenance fees. Nathan finally met his grandmother in the very house my father had tried to use as a ransom note, a meeting that felt like the closing of a circle that had been broken 3 decades ago. I stood in the kitchen of that yellow bungalow and watched as my brother, the carpenter with the square jaw and the sawdust under his fingernails, sat at the small table and held Grandma Ruth's hand, a connection that was mathematical, biological, and now, finally, emotional. Nathan's 5-year-old daughter, Lily, who had spent her entire life in a 900-square-foot apartment with a view of a brick wall and a dumpster, finally has a real backyard to play in, a space where she can run across the grass without her father having to worry about the cost of a gallon of milk or the next rent hike. Watching her chase a ball near the hydrangea bushes Grandma Ruth has tended for half a century was the only proof I needed that the responsible daughter had made the right choice by choosing the messy truth over the perfect lie. My father's empire of appearances had been built on the exclusion of this child, and seeing her laugh in the very space he tried to liquidate felt like the ultimate audit of his soul, a debt paid in full by the sheer joy of a little girl who didn't know she was a secret. I have officially blocked my parents' numbers on my iPhone 15 Pro, a digital boundary that reflects the physical and emotional one I have spent the last few weeks constructing with the same precision I use to monitor a patient's post-operative recovery. I told them through a single final email that I would not engage with them. I would not attend the performative family dinners, and I would not allow them back into my life until they could lead with the absolute truth instead of threats and extortion. My brother Marcus, the golden child who sat silently while our father threatened his own grandmother, has found that the luxury lifestyle he enjoyed was also a casualty of the collapse, as the business loans and the sapphire blue Porsche were revealed to be part of the same fraudulent balance sheet Gerald Evans used to control us all. Marcus now has to face the reality of his own $99 kit, a mirror of the one that exposed our father, and find a way to build a life that isn't a reflection of a deacon's stolen glory. The 60-hour weeks I continue to work at County General no longer feel like a burden or a way to prove my worth to a man who couldn't see it. They feel like the foundation of a life that is entirely my own, paid for with honesty and sustained by the integrity of my own hands. The $1,200 grandfather clock in the colonial hallway still ticks, but it marks the passing of a legacy that has been declared bankrupt by the very community that once worshipped it. My father's 3-paragraph resignation was the white flag of a man who realized that his brand was worth nothing when compared to the weight of a manila envelope full of receipts and DNA certificates. Every time I drive past the Grace Bible Church and see the empty space in the front pew, left side, I am reminded that family isn't the people who share your blood but treat you like a liability. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out and the gold plating begins to flake away. We are currently in the process of legally transferring the deed of Grandma Ruth's bungalow entirely into her name, ensuring that no deacon or regional manager can ever use her safety as a bargaining chip again, a surgical legal procedure that is final and non-negotiable. Nathan and I are learning how to be siblings in the gaps between his carpentry jobs and my ICU shifts, discovering that we share more than just a cleft chin. We share a resilience that was forged in the shadows of a man who thought he could erase us. Lily's laughter in the backyard of the yellow bungalow is the new soundtrack of our lives, a sound that is infinitely more beautiful than the practiced baritone of a deacon's sermon or the mechanical ticking of an expensive clock. I look at my hands now, and I don't see the invisible daughter or the backup plan. I see a woman who had the courage to look at a 2.1 star rating and a 3-page letter and decide that the truth was worth more than the colonial house on Heritage Way. The fallout was total because the lie was total, a 30-year construction project that required the silence of a bank teller, the erasure of children, and the intimidation of an elderly woman to remain standing. My name is Sienna Evans, and for the first time in my 34 years, I am not living a performance or managing a brand. I am simply a daughter, a sister, and a nurse who knows that the most important vital sign of any family is the truth. The gold standard has been decommissioned, and in its place is something much stronger, something made of sawdust and scrubs and the quiet, undeniable strength of a 78-year-old woman who refused to be called crazy anymore. We are planning a small dinner for next Sunday, not with platinum-rimmed china or mandatory attendance, but with paper plates and a mismatched set of chairs in Grandma Ruth's kitchen, where the only thing on the menu is the comfort of knowing exactly who is sitting at the table. Nathan is building a new set of shelves for the bungalow, his hands working the wood with a skill that our father never bothered to acknowledge, and Lily is decorating them with the same colorful drawings that used to hang on a cheap refrigerator in Briarfield. The world of Gerald Evans has shrunk to the size of a 3-paragraph email and a silent colonial house, while our world has expanded to include the strangers who were always our blood but never our family until now. I have learned that the messy truth is always preferable to the perfect lie, because while the lie requires constant maintenance and a $450 monthly fee for appearances, the truth is a self-sustaining ecosystem that allows you to breathe even when the air is thin. I sit on the porch of my own house, the one I bought at 29 without a dime of help, and I realize that the receipts of my life are finally balanced, the debt of my father's expectations paid off by the courage of my own convictions. The sun is setting over Cedarville, but it's a different kind of light now, one that doesn't hide the cracks in the hedges but illuminates the path forward for a family that is no longer defined by a deacon's reputation. Grandma Ruth is safe, Nathan is seen, and I am finally, officially, off duty from the business of being anyone's secret or anyone's pawn. The brand is dead, the truth is alive, and the backyard is full of the kind of life that no amount of professional landscaping could ever produce. It is a start, a raw and honest beginning that belongs only to us, and it is more than enough to build a future on, one brick, one truth, and one heartbeat at a time. Family is not the name on the colonial deed. Family is the person who holds the manila envelope and says, "I am not tired of the truth anymore." I have chosen the messy truth, and while the fallout was total, the freedom that followed is absolute, a biological and mathematical certainty that I will carry with me for the rest of my life.